Being both an American and an Estonian citizen, I've always had a keen interest in how my heritage relates to my nationality as an American. Before I completed this project, I had heard many stories about my grandparents and their journeys to the United States from Estonia, and so I wondered, for how long have Estonians been coming to the United States, and how did they integrate into their country? To address this question, I first needed to define what was integration. I needed to relate this definition to immigration to the United States as a topic. I eventually came to define integration as the following: the entry into the new country, as well as the ways in which people were able to live with basic human rights and fair treatment, obtain employment, and other measures of social welfare. I also formulated one single question to base all of my research around. This question was, to what extent did the social and political climates of the United States affect the integration of Estonian immigrants between 1918 and 1950? I began to research integration in this time period by dividing it into two. The first of these divisions was the time prior to the Second World War. During this period, the social climate was characterized by an animosity towards immigrants and other foreigners. One example of this is the belief in nativism, which is defined by John Higham in his book Strangers in the Land as intense opposition to an internal minority on the ground of its foreign, i.e. un-American, connections. Many in the United States at this time held negative views of communists, socialists, anarchists, and other political radicals. This can be seen in the violence and anxiety exhibited in the first Red Scare of 1919, as well as the deportation of anarchists. This social climate had a negative impact on the integration of Estonians into the United States, those who had already been in the country for a number of years, as well as those who had recently immigrated. Many of these Estonians were involved in workers' unions led by political radicals. Further, being under Russian occupation for a time meant that Estonians were associated with Russia, and therefore Bolshevism or communism. However, with their close-knit communities and strong work ethic, Estonians were able to build themselves a reputation in the United States, positively affecting their integration. The political climate of the time also had a significant impact on integration, by virtue of limiting the number of immigrants who could enter the United States. The number of foreigners who could enter the United States at this time was affected by a number of restrictive immigration policies. These included the introduction of a literacy test in 1917, as well as the Emergency Quota Act of May 1920, the Johnson-Reid Act of 1924, and a further modification of this policy. The following video, produced in 1946, details one of these immigration policies.
In 1924, a law was passed to restrict immigration from countries outside the Western Hemisphere. By this law, the number to be admitted henceforth was to be in proportion to the national origin of our country's population. This gave to Northern and Western Europe more than 80% of the total, while Southern and Eastern Europe received less than 20%. After 1924, immigration from Europe dwindled and virtually stopped during the depression of the 1930s.
In September 1944, the Nazi occupation of Estonia during World War II came to an end. With their chances of victory crumbling, the Soviets came back once again to take over Estonia for occupation. With the fear of deportations and conscription, this is when most Estonians escaped. The Soviet flag was raised over Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, on September 23, 1944. People did whatever they could to escape. Some went by boat to Finland, but were turned back due to the treaty Finland had signed with Russia. Others went to Sweden, where they took temporary refuge. Most ended up going to Germany with the assistance of the retreating Germans, but some died in the process. In one case, 2,700 Estonians and Germans were killed when Soviet torpedo planes sunk the clearly marked hospital ship Morero. 75,000 people escaped in total. The country's total population was 1.2 million. Those who escaped to Germany were left destitute and homeless until the first DP, or displaced persons camps, were set up. For a few years, people moved from camp to camp with other Estonians around the different Allied-controlled sectors of Germany. In these DP camps, DPs strive to attain some normality in their lives by setting up schools, services, cultural groups, churches, and even scouting programs. The latter was representative of their motivation to retain their national identity wherever they were, and this carried on to their settlement in the USA. The UNNRA, or United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Association, managed the survival of Estonians in these camps, while each respective Allied country was responsible for their rations of camps in each zone. In Geislingen camp alone, the population had reached 3,605 in December 1945. At the same time, some refugees who had been in Sweden sailed all the way to Florida in small vessels that were known as Viking boats. These people were trying to reach North America by any means possible, bypassing the necessary legal procedure of obtaining a visa and traveling through dangerous conditions on the Atlantic Ocean. Being under the force of law like any immigrant, they were almost sent back, but President Harry S. Truman made sure they were able to stay. In his official statement made in 1946, he exhibits sympathy and, quote, directed that all avenues be explored towards enabling this group to remain here, if they so desire, so that they may eventually become citizens of this country. President Truman was also behind the Displaced Persons Act of 1948, which was passed to help refugees from Europe who were fleeing persecution if they were good citizens. With 2,000 visas offered initially, but this number later expanded. In fact, refugees residing in the United States before the 1st of April of 1948 could apply to the Attorney General in order to live in the country permanently. The final necessary step for refugees was to become sponsored by someone in the U.S. to ensure that refugees did not become a public responsibility. These sponsors were sometimes individuals who would support arrivals with a place to stay and other necessities. Church organizations from the Lutheran denomination and other organizations like the Church of World Service provided the most sponsorships. Immigrants gradually left Germany to settle across the United States. Wherever they were across the United States, it did not take long for these people to integrate. But to bring all this information to life, let's look at 2 interviews that I conducted showing real-life examples. So, if I showed you these photos here, did they bring back any memories? Geislingen DP children. Wow. Yeah, there were a lot of them. Does it remind you of how you came to the United States? Well, I was 10 when I left Estonia during the war, and we were actually able to go to Germany. We were there at a displaced persons camp. Which camp were you in? I was in what you called at the time a traveling camp, almost, because there were some that were pretty well stationary. But I started out in a town called Kempten, and then Kempten was moved to Gerestrid, and then Gerestrid to Aldenstadt, then Aldenstadt back to Kempten again. So I ended up being in 4 different camps, but essentially it was the same group of people. But some of them did actually have a number of people that didn't like these moves, so they ended up being able to go to Geislingen, and that became really the largest concentration of them. I think something in the range of 5,000 Estonians. The one group that I was with maybe had initially about 1,000 at the time, and by the time everyone ended up traveling around there were 700 or 800. And then in 1949, we were able to find, or a sponsor was able to find us who was in Chicago. There was a lady, her name was Elena Clayton, and she was an old Estonian lady, and very capable. And she had connections to, she was married to, I believe, a General Motors vice president in the Chicago area, and they lived in Hinsdale. And so she took it upon herself, and the rules at the time, I think Congress passed a law to allow these people to come to Chicago, or to the United States generally, but they had to have sponsors. And so she found sponsors for, I believe, something close to 200 families around this area, by virtue of having acquaintances and connections. And so we ended up being sponsored or permitted to go and live in Winnetka. There was a well-to-do man there who was president of United Electric Coal, and that guy is pretty well known even today. He's fairly well off. So we were there for a number of years. I ended up going to New Trier High School, and that was at the time considered, recognized as one of the best high schools in the whole country, or at least that's what they said. And ended up going to Northwestern University, so I met my wife over there in the university. My family were my father, my mother, and I. I've been here since 1949 in the Chicago area, so I guess I consider myself a Chicagoan now. So what did you end up studying at university? I studied engineering, and then I ended up working in several places in the Chicago area, and ended up working 25 years at Greeley & Hansen, which was a downtown Chicago firm. It was a consulting firm, really. It was privately owned, a partnership, but now it's an LLC, so I was a consultant working for them. I was an electrical engineer, and Hansen was in water and wastewater. So how did you find it fitting into the Chicago area? Was it difficult adjusting to living in America? Well, I was young at the time. I was 15. I think I was at a very fortunate age, really, where you really learn the language pretty fast. Like if you're over 20, whereas if you're over 20, you don't pick it up. But I think for me, our first year at high school, actually in the Estonian camp, they had a grade school there, they had high schools, and they taught us English and German we knew anyway, because of just being there. Although, the camps were pretty well isolated from the German people. We arrived in Germany in 1944, and we spent a year there before the camps were set up. So it was much tougher for the kids being in Germany than in the United States. And because the United States basically accepts people, this is an immigrant country, I never had a problem where people would make fun of me or make a problem out of it, but obviously they knew I wasn't one of them. But the people here are much more tolerant. In Germany, they would call me Verfluchte Ausländer. That means damned foreigner. There, people were not tolerant. I went on to ask him about how he became involved in the Estonian house in Chicago. Mr. Swigusar told me how the Estonia grew from a sizable community of Estonians and cooperated with a Finnish community center that had already existed in Chicago, but eventually grew into its own independent society years after arriving in their new home. The Estonia formally began in 1967. In addition, I interviewed my own grandfather, Ants Stetsov, and his brother, N. My grandfather told me of how he migrated from the DP camps in Germany all the way to the United States. His experiences were much like any other Estonian who emigrated to the United States. His passage took him from the DP camps in Germany, through Hamburg, and across the Atlantic Ocean on a U.S. luxury ship known as the Marina Shark. He arrived in Manhattan, New York City, from which point he traveled across the United States with his family to Omaha, Nebraska. Here, he and his family worked as farmhands on the farm owned by their sponsors. At first, their new lives in the United States were difficult. because they had to learn to adjust to more primitive conditions than they had come from. In search of better conditions, the family moved once again, this time to Crystal Lake, Illinois, outside of Chicago. Here, aunts would gain qualifications to set up a successful family contracting business with two of his brothers. It's through these anecdotes, these stories, in addition to my own research, that I was able to find out more about my family history, and to put it into context of the rest of history, what was going on during, before, and after the events of the Second World War. I came to learn that the social and political climates of the United States made an indelible impact on the integration of Estonian immigrants into the United States. Prior to the Second World War, this impact was more negative than positive. However, subsequent to the Second World War, the impacts of the social and political climates of the United States on integration had an extremely positive impact, and the community of Estonians that was once established still flourishes to this day.